Hello everybody, and welcome to something that is a little bit new, but not really because of the fact that I did it before when this game first came out. It is a new game. This is a video on a game called World of Magic. However, as you can see, we are not in World of Magic. Rather, I'm looking at statistics of World of Magic, and I'm explaining them to you so you can have a better understanding of the game. So World of Magic is a game that came out about maybe a month ago. I had this video recorded and ready to be edited, and then I realized, hey, this would be a lot easier for people to understand if I gave them pictures. So I spent like a month making graphs for you so that you could easily understand it. So basically, we're going to start at the top, as you see here. We're starting with acid, right? We're starting from the left side and then on the top. So as you see here, right? Acid and acid climb each other, but right here, acid and water. In this case, acid is stronger than water. That's what this means. And then acid is weaker than earth. So green is good, red is bad. We're going from the left. The left is the magic hitting the magic on the top. So if acid, hits a tie. If acid hits water, acid wins. If acid hits earth, earth wins. Right? That's what we're trying to do. And don't worry, I have the graphs, so those will be easy for you to understand. We'll show those at the end of every little cut talk. So basically, let's go ahead and let's actually start talking about these things. So acid ties with acid, wins against water, ink, and fire, loses to earth, ties with ice, wins against lightning, ties with magma, wins against wood, and then ties with light, wind, and shadow, loses to iron, wins against paper and poison, loses to gold, ties with plasma, wins against sand, loses to glass, crystal, and then wins against snow, loses to explosion, and then wins against ash. And now we'll show you the graph. That's how we're going to go over these. We're just going to talk about them, then we'll show you the visual representation, and that's what you're going to do. And also, in case you're wondering, I would imagine that you actually play the game if you're watching this video, but the little elements on screen, those are the elements for indications, which like that swirly white one is wind, and that glowing light sparkle is light, type of thing. And obviously, there's three acids because we have acid tying with, acid beating, and acid losing. So now we'll go into water. Water loses to acid, ties with itself. Every element ties with itself, by the way. Loses to ink because acid and ink are just stronger versions of water. Wins against fire, loses to earth and ice. Wins against lightning for some reason, which defies Pokemon logic right there, bro. So does losing to earth. Wins against magma, loses to wood, ties with light, wind, and shadow, loses to iron, wins against paper, ties with poison, loses to gold, wins against plasma and sand, loses to glass, crystal, snow, and explosion, and then wins against ash. Here's your visual representation, as you can see here. That's a little easier to understand. And yeah, we're just gonna go ahead and boom, 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 boom them, just like that. So next up is ink. Ink loses to acid, wins against water, ties with itself, wins against fire, loses to earth and ice, wins against lightning and magma, loses to wood, ties with light, wind, and shadow, loses to iron, wins against paper and poison, loses to gold, wins against plasma and sand, loses to glass and crystal, ties with snow, loses to explosion, and wins against ash. Here's your visual representation, as you can see here. Makes it a little bit easier to understand. Now we'll go over fire. Fire loses to acid and water, wins against, it loses to ink. See, right here, you can see that the ink is green, right? This was the person who made the document that kind of messed up right there. But as you see, the green ones are 1 is over 1. A 1 is a tie, and then below a 1 is a loss. So fire loses to acid and water and ink, ties with itself, loses to earth and ice, ties with lightning, loses to magma, wins against wood, ties with light, wind, and shadow, loses to iron, wins against paper, ties with poison, loses to gold, plasma, and sand, wins against glass, loses to crystal, wins against snow, loses to explosion, and wins against ash. Boom, visual representation. Next we will move on to Earth, who is going to have a very big winning streak here. Earth wins against acid, water, ink, fire, ties with itself, wins against ice, loses to lightning and magma, wins against wood, light, wind, and shadow, loses to iron, wins against paper and poison, loses to gold, wins against plasma, sand, glass, crystal, and snow, ties with explosion, and wins against ash. Visual representation, So the way I'm talking about these is kind of invoking my pronunciation issue. I'm kind of starting to have issues talking, so I should probably slow down, but the thing is I'm saying the same thing over and over. Wins against, ties against, or loses to. So I'm sorry if I sound incorrect or anything. This is also why we have the visual representation to help us out. Ice, ties with acid, wins against water and ink, loses to fire and earth, ties with itself, loses to lightning, magma, and wood, wins against light and wind, loses to shadow and iron, wins against paper and poison, loses to gold and plasma, wins against sand and glass, loses to crystal, wins against snow, loses to explosion, and wins against ash. Visual representation of ice, there you go. Now we'll go over lightning. Lightning loses to acid, water, and ink. Again, defying Pokemon logic, all the water type elements defeat lightning, which is no. Lightning ties with fire, wins against earth and ice, because ice is a little bit of water in it, but also not really, it's more of a solid. Ties with itself and magma, wins against wood and light. You see it's happening right there. Loses to wind, however, but wins against shadow. Then loses to iron, wins against paper, ties with poison, loses to gold, wins against plasma, sand, and then ties with glass, crystal, and snow. Wins against explosion and ties with ash. Visual representation of lightning, as you can see here. And really quick, I just want to point out that there are about, I think there's like 24 types of magic, but I'm probably wrong. Probably, it's somewhere around the 20 area, but now we'll go on to magma. Ties with acid, loses to water and ink, wins against fire, earth, and ice, ties with lightning and itself, wins against wood, light, wind, shadow, iron, paper, poison, gold, plasma, sand, and glass. Humongous winning streak. Ties with crystal, wins against snow, and then ties with explosion and ash. Visual representation. Now we'll go over wood, who loses to acid, wins against water and ink, loses to fire and earth, wins against ice, loses to lightning and magma, ties with wood, wins against light, wind, and shadow, loses to iron, wins against paper and poison, loses to gold and plasma, wins against sand and glass, loses to crystal, wins against snow, ties with explosion, and loses to ash. Visual representation of wood. Okay, now we'll go over light. Ties with acid, water, ink, and fire, loses to earth, ice, lightning, magma, and wood, ties with itself, wins against wind, ties with shadow, loses to iron, paper, poison, gold, plasma, and sand, ties with glass, and then loses to crystal, snow, explosion, and ash. Visual representation of light. There you go. Now I'll go over wind. Ties with acid, water, ink, and fire, loses against earth and ice, wins against lightning, loses to magma, wood, and light, ties with itself, loses to shadow, loses to iron, wins against paper and poison, loses to gold and plasma, wins against sand, loses to glass and crystal, wins against snow, loses to explosion, and wins against ash. Visual representation of wind up here. Really quick reminder that I spent months making these graphs for them to be on screen for a few seconds. Oof, that's depressing. Now we'll go over shadow. Ties with acid, water, ink, and fire, loses to earth, wins against ice, loses to lightning, magma, and wood, ties with light, wins against wind, ties with itself, loses to iron, ties with paper, wins against poison, loses to gold, wins against plasma, loses to sand, glass, crystal, snow, and explosion, and then wins against ash. Visual representation of the shadow. Next up, you'll go over iron, who is one of the most dense ones. By the way, these are for the clashes, and the size and the level of your character will also depend on if you win the clash. But this is like if they were both even. Like if you're both level 1 and you just start and you clash these magics, these are what would win. But anyway, let's go over iron. Wins against acid, water, ink, fire, earth, ice, and lightning. Loses to magma. Wins against wood, light, wind, and shadow. Ties with itself. Wins against paper and poison. Loses to gold. Wins against plasma, sand, glass, crystal, snow, explosion, and ash. Visual representation of iron. Now we will go over paper, who has a lot of losing matchups. Paper loses to acid, water, ink, fire, earth, ice, lightning, magma, wood, then wins against light, loses to wind, ties with shadow, loses to iron, ties with itself, loses to poison, gold, plasma, sand, glass, crystal, snow, explosion, and ash. Visual representation of the paper magic. There you go. Now we'll go for poison. Poison loses to acid, ties with water, loses to ink, ties with fire, loses to earth and ice, ties with lightning, loses to magma and wood, wins against light, loses to wind, shadow, and iron, wins against paper, ties with itself, loses to gold, plasma, sand, glass, crystal, snow, ties with explosion, loses to ash, visual representation of the poison magic. Now we go over gold, who is effectively the best magic for clashing, but is very slow. Gold wins against acid, water, ink, fire, earth, ice, lightning, loses to magma, wins against wood, light, wind, shadow, iron, paper, poison, ties with itself, wins against plasma, sand, glass, crystal, snow, explosion, and ash. Visual representation of gold up here. As you can see, he's a very one-sided type of person. But now we'll go over plasma, ties with acid, loses to water and ink, wins against fire, loses to earth, ice, lightning, and magma, wins against wood, light, wind, and then loses to shadow and iron, wins against paper and poison, loses to gold, ties with itself, ties with sand, wins against glass, loses to crystal, wins against snow, explosion, and ash. Visual representation. I really need to start giving myself bigger breaks between when I talk, because, oh wow, whew, I'm getting very, as you see right there, I'm getting stuttering. Now we'll go over sand. Loses to acid, water, and ink, wins against fire, loses to earth, ice, lightning, magma, wood, and then wins against light, loses to wind, wins against shadow, loses to iron, wins against paper and poison, loses to gold, ties with plasma and itself, loses to glass and crystal, ties with snow, loses to explosion, and wins against ash. Visual representation of sand magic. Now we will go over glass. Wins against acid, water, and ink, loses to fire, earth, and ice, ties with lightning, loses to magma and wood, ties with light, wins against wind and shadow, loses to iron, wins against paper and poison, loses to gold and plasma, wins against sand, ties with itself, loses to crystal, wins against snow, loses to explosion, and wins against ash. Visual representation of the glass magic. And now we will go over crystal. Wins against acid, water, ink, fire, loses to earth, wins against ice, ties with lightning and magma, wins against wood, light, wind, and shadow, loses to iron, wins against paper and poison, loses to gold, wins against plasma, sand, and glass, ties with itself, wins against snow, loses to explosion, and wins against ash. Visual representation of snow magic. Oh no, crystal magic, that's crystal magic. Whoops. Now we'll go over snow magic. Loses to acid, wins against water, ties with ink, loses to fire, earth, and ice, ties with lightning, loses to magma and wood, wins against light, loses to wind, wins against shadow, loses to iron, wins against paper and poison, loses to gold and plasma, ties with sand, loses to glass and crystal, ties with itself, loses to explosion and ash. Visual representation of snow. Now we'll go over explosion magic. Wins against acid, water, ink, fire, ties with earth, wins against ice, loses to lightning, ties with magma and wood, wins against light, wind, and shadow, loses to iron, wins against paper, and ties with poison, loses to gold and plasma, wins against sand, glass, crystal, snow, ties with itself, and wins against ash. Visual representation. And now we'll go over ash, which is the last magic. Loses to acid, water, ink, fire, earth, ice, ties with lightning and magma, wins against wood and light, loses to wind, shadow, and iron, wins against paper and poison, loses to gold, plasma, sand, glass, and crystal, wins against snow, loses to explosion, and ties with itself. So as you see here, this was effectively like a 15-minute or 13, 14, whatever. It was basically a 10-minute video of me just talking over the statistics, however, making these images that would help you understand it better. It took me a lot longer than it would to have made this video, and I wanted to make it easier for you to understand, even though it was delayed. I hope this does help you. So as always, I hope you all like the game, favorite the game, like, comment, subscribe, all the good stuff, and as always, I will see you all in the next video.